All right, I think we're going to get started here. It's just about that time. Just wanted to say welcome, everybody, and good morning. We really hope that you enjoyed the keynote speaker this morning and had an engaging and fun networking break together, which was graciously sponsored by Intercept. We want to welcome all of you to our first breakout session of the day. This is track 4, What's Now? Innovation in Rare Disease. My name is Jessica Shiles, and I will be your breakout session host for this morning's session. And I'd also like to welcome those of you joining us remotely. Please feel free to join us on the live stream, and I'd like to also remind everybody to just go ahead and download our mobile app in order to use some of our highlighted features and also join the live question and answer that we have. So today's session is Technologies for Learning About Rare Disease for Patients and Caregivers. And we will hear from experts and advocates on how to successfully manage and track disease symptoms using the different technologies and different methods. Today we're actually going to be hearing from a great group of people. Amy Gray, CEO of the Charcot-Marie-Tooth Association. We also have James Valentine, Associate of Hyman Phelps and McNamara, and Maya Brown Zimmerman. So we'll go ahead and welcome them up one by one, but our first speaker today is going to be Amy.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Jessica, for the warm welcome. It's really a pleasure to be here at the Global Gene Summit and to be speaking on this topic. As Jessica mentioned, my name is Amy Gray, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the CMTA. And I was asked to participate in this panel because of some of the insights that we're learning as an organization on burden of disease and the use of a new technology that's providing some really important learnings for our community. So I'm going to share a little background on CMT, on our organization, how we fulfill our mission, both on the research end, on improving quality of life, and then talk specifically about the technology we're using and some of the learnings that are coming out of the technology. Just a little background on Charcot-Marie-Tooth. It is a neuromuscular disease that affects the peripheral nerves and the muscles. So as the peripheral nerves in the arms and the legs start to die and degrade, the muscles attached to them atrophy. And as the muscles atrophy, there can be many different symptoms that patients experience, from loss of hands and feet to foot deformities, fatigue, weakness, there's psychosocial issues, from depression, and a whole host of other symptoms. But really some of the more common symptoms that we hear from the community are the mobility issues associated with loss of hands, feet, and then in some work we did last year in conjunction with the Hereditary Neuropathy Foundation, really shown a lot of light on the psychosocial issues as well. Now, 1 in 2,500 people are living with CMT, so it affects about 150,000 people here in the US and around 3 million people worldwide. And many cases are inherited. Many patients inherit the disease both dominantly as well as recessively, depending on the type of CMT, but there are more and more spontaneous mutations that we're hearing about. Over 90 genes have been identified that cause CMT, and researchers believe there are probably another 40 to 50 genes of the rarer forms of the disease that have not been identified yet. So what is our organization doing to support the community? Well, our mission is really twofold. We have 2 strong pillars that we stand behind. We're really focused on driving and accelerating treatments for our community, as well as helping improve the quality of life today. And we do that through a variety of ways. We have a network of over 75 branches around the country and over 30 centers of excellence. We host a number of education programs and conferences throughout the year. We have an incredible youth initiative and a camp program for kids with CMT, and a lot more. And on the research side of things, there's some really exciting things taking place right now, which really leads us to this burden of disease work and the use of this technology. Our organization has always been very focused on investing in research, and in the early years, it was better understanding what causes the disease. But by the early 2000s, a lot of the genes for CMT had been, or many genes, I should say, for CMT had been identified, so it was in 2008 that our board of directors sat down and said, we have a really unique opportunity now to accelerate treatments for our community. And at that time, we launched STAR, which is our strategy to accelerate research. And what STAR's focus really is getting a treatment to our community as quickly as possible. Right now, there is no disease-modifying therapy, and that's our number one priority, is getting a treatment to our community. Now, in the last 10 years, we have invested more than $12 million in STAR, and developed a really robust research strategy that has been guided by over 30 experts, clinicians, researchers, scientists, people that have brought drugs to market, and they've really helped guide our strategy to ensure that we're putting our investments in the wisest places possible. We're funding over 50 active research projects, and a lot of work is being done on biomarkers, wearable sensors, and a lot of the gaps that have been identified in research are being filled, either have been filled already or are being filled now through some of the research projects that we're funding. Our organization is also very unique in that we've created what we call a research toolbox, where we provide animal models, stem cell lines, assays that we've licensed, that we have the patents to industry, to researchers, and we provide those tools to them so they can either fail fast or move forward. And what that has allowed us to do is to really attract a lot of new industry partners and to explore CMT, utilizing and testing some of the compounds that they're developing. Now, this has led to almost 25 industry partnerships just in the last 2 years, and we're working with some of the top pharma biotech companies and are attracting a lot more to the space, something that we're really proud of. So as we're working on this, we realize there's a lot of opportunity to bring patients more into the fold and really hear the voice of the patient. As companies are gearing up, we have a couple companies in trial right now, and many other companies expected to go to trial soon. And patients have always been a really big part of our organization's mission in helping drive not only the work that we're doing on a day in and day out basis, but also helping drive our research strategy. And so it was last year that we formalized a program for patients called Patients as Partners in Research. And what we do is we really offer that program and that initiative to our industry partners so we can better understand what their corporate strategies are, what challenges they're running up against, and what we as an organization can do to bring patients and their perspective into filling some of those needs. And the number one need we kept hearing from our partners was on disease burden. We want to better understand what the burden of disease is in CMT. How much does it cost to the patient when they have CMT? What does it cost to society? What are the burdens on quality of life to the patient, to the workplace? And it was apparent after a number of conversations that this was a big gap and a role that we and other organizations in our space could play in really forwarding this initiative. So again, with companies currently in trial and a lot of companies gearing up, we felt this was an area that we could really get behind collaboratively with the other organizations internationally. So we've been able to partner with an organization in the US called the Hereditary Neuropathy Foundation and a number of international CMT organizations to move this burden of disease work forward in a way that our organizations are able to tap into sponsorship from industry. And the sponsorship from industry has developed a new technology, an app that's gathering this data that we need to really calculate and quantify and qualify burden of disease in CMT. And this is a screenshot of what the app looks like. And really what I don't like to refer to it as an app because it's really a research study. This is data that we need to gather that's really critical, gaps in information out there. And there's really been no studies done like this holistically, definitely not in the US, a few studies here or there in Europe. So this is the first time internationally that we will be putting this kind of initiative forward and really engaging patients worldwide that are living with CMT to gather this this information. And really the best way of going about doing that is using real-world evidence, using technology to help us gather that information. So the sponsor that we're working with enlisted a developer, and the developer is an expert in putting these kind of apps together for patient advocacy groups and for disease areas. And they really worked with each of our patient organizations to understand what we thought was critical information to include, in this study. And we all sit on an advisory board. In addition to all the patient advocacy groups, there's also representatives from the scientific and clinical community as well. And we've really been the guiding force behind informing the developer as to what kind of information needs to be gathered, how can you best gather it, and then what can we do with that data. So what I want to share with you a little bit, this was just soft launched, this research initiative, and this app was just rolled out last year, soft launched last year in October. Since then, it's launched in several countries, US first, and then in Europe in several countries. Over 1,300 patients have now signed up to participate, and we're starting to gather data. Now with CMT, because it is a slowly progressing disease, this study needs to go on for several years so we can gather the information we need and really understand how CMT takes a toll on patients, both financially but also on the quality of life. So 2.5 years can be a long time for a study, and so there's a lot of new things that need to be introduced along the way to keep patients involved in it, and the developer's been really great about getting input directly from us and the other patient advocacy groups that sit on this SAB. But over 1,300 patients have enrolled, and 2.5 years will have the data that we need to really calculate and quantify burden of disease. I think, and the developer kept telling all of us, we will have information that we'll be gathering along the way, and this information is really going to help illuminate different things that are happening within the community. And I think it took all of us a little bit by surprise about the quality of some of the early information that was coming out and the richness of that, and how we as organizations could take that information that's coming directly from the community and do something with it. So this is one example. So when patients download the app, they fill out a lot of basic information about themselves, when they were diagnosed, when the symptoms first started showing up, what kind of doctors they see, a lot of different information, what kind of medications they're on, what kind of assistive walking devices they may use, and they fill all that out once, and then they're done with that. And then every so often, they're prompted to fill out surveys. And these surveys are some of the questions that have all kind of met rigor of any kind of study of this sort. And it's those survey questions that are starting to yield some really important nuggets for us. So this is one of the first surveys that we found really insightful, and it asked patients about the different symptoms and how they would rank them in terms of importance. And with CMT, because there can be loss of function of feet and the muscles in the feet and foot deformities that lead to difficulty with mobility, that is one of the symptoms that we most commonly historically have heard about as a top issue for our community. And what this study really informed us of is that the weakness in hands and fingers is almost equal to that for the patients that have participated so far in this survey. And although we know that the peripheral nerves that lead down to the hands can cause loss of function in hands, it's typically in the past not been one of the symptoms and issues that has risen to the top of the list. And so this has really illuminated an opportunity for our organizations to kind of go back to our advisory boards, our patient advisory boards, and think about what we can do as a community to start developing some programs and maybe do some further research in this area about treatment specifically for hands and fingers. Another area that has come out of the study that, not ground, shaking, earth shaking by any means, but help validate some previous studies is just the prevalence of CMT and some of the more common subtypes. And it really confirms some early data some data that's been out there historically. So this information that's being gathered is available to the patient advocacy groups, But researchers can also request to get access to the blinded data, and it really can be used to help further research into other areas of CMT. So this was important because it helped confirm some earlier research in papers published. I should go back, because what I think is also very interesting about CMT is that there are pockets within the world where we see certain subtypes show up more prevalently than others. And I think as we gather more information, we'll be able to dive down into each country and look at the prevalence in each country, which may help us develop treatments or figure out better ways of running trials in specific targeted, geo-targeted areas moving forward as more drugs, come to trial. Another area that we thought was really interesting was a question asked about the types of physicians people are seeing and most frequently seeing. And only about 10% of patients are seeing a CMT-trained neurologist. And we're always advocating that they go see a CMT-trained neurologist. But we've never really known where are they going. And although anecdotally we hear from the community who they see, we know they see PTs, physical therapists, we know they see general practitioners, we know they see podiatrists, we know they see surgeons. We've never really had any data on this. And so this nugget has really come out of the study as an area where we now have some data to show on the types of doctors the patients are seeing. And this will help illuminate some opportunities for us from an education and awareness standpoint, and the patient advocacy groups can really kind of band together to get more education out there to family doctors. A lot of our patients are seeing a family doctor. There's a neurologist doesn't even show up on this list. So there's some work that we have to do, and the technology that we're using as part of this burden of disease initiative is really illuminating this for us. And I think it's taken all of our organizations by surprise at the richness of the data that's coming out of this for such a long-term project, how we can have these really insightful learnings along the way and deploy programs and initiatives to really support the community in these areas. Another area that came out of the study was on the impact of your work life. And this is something that we're hearing more and more from some of the youth that have come to our camp and are then going off to apply for college, trying to figure out what professions to go into, what kind of profession, am I going to be able to withstand 5 years from now, 10 years now? And the disease can progress differently depending on the subtype. So some interesting data that came out of this was, how it affects their professional life and the type of job that people are choosing and the number of days that they have to take sick leave and working part-time versus full-time. And so it's kind of illuminated another area where we can go back to our advisory board, to our youth council, and think about what kind of programs we can develop to help educate, mentor, help inform some of our younger patients as they're going through these different transitions in life. And I don't have a slide with my contact information, but it is on our website, cmtausa.org. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about the app that we are using and this initiative that we're a part of, or about anything else that I presented here today. So thank you.
Next, I'm going to introduce to you Maya Brown Zimmerman.
Hello. So every great solution starts with a really big problem. And at the Marfan Foundation, our problem was that we didn't have a way to track the genetic causes, symptoms, and outcomes of a group of related and complex genetic connective tissue disorders. 1 in every 5,000 to 10,000 people is affected with Marfan syndrome, but when you add in the related conditions that the Marfan Foundation also serves, like vascular Ehlers-Danlos, Loeys-Dietz syndrome, and Beal syndrome, that number easily becomes at least 1 in every 5,000. If we're looking just at Marfan, we know that it's linked to only one gene, but that there are over 600 pathogenic changes to that gene. And if we're listing effects, Marfan syndrome patients can see symptoms in the cardiovascular, ocular, pulmonary, and nervous systems, as well as in the skin and bones. So then you add in the genes for all of the related conditions, and their affected symptoms. And all of that to say, there's a ton of data to capture. And patients have questions themselves as well. They want to know, are there effects to the GI system? Are there increased risks with each subsequent pregnancy? Does location of the change to the FBN1 gene predict whether a patient will respond to the medication losartan? So the Marfan Foundation Board of Directors started discussing a registry about 8 years ago. If any of you have been a part of this process before, you know that there's a whole lot to debate and decide ahead of time. So we had to ask ourselves, who should the registry be designed for and who should have ownership of it? Did we want the registry to focus solely on the cardiovascular issues, or did we want to collect data on all of the body systems? Did we want this to be primarily for patients or for researchers? Eventually, we had enough fleshed out that we decided to put together a task force of board members, some with Marfan syndrome and some who don't have it but have affected family members, our CEO, and some of the prominent expert doctors in our field to find a company that fit what we were looking for. So there were 3 things that we had on our must-have list. The first, it was really important to us that we have an ownership in the data. Why? We wanted to be able to control what was done with it, and we wanted the ability to move it around should the hosting company close or should we decide to go in a different direction at some point. 2, members of our community needed to be able to submit their data and to have a stake in the project. And 3, we required space to ask a lot of questions of our members, given how much data that there is to capture. So because of this, it took a long time to find a company to work with. In fact, we couldn't find one at first that offered all of the things that we wanted for a price that we were able to afford. And so we were trying to decide what to compromise on when we came across a startup company that wanted to work with us. As their first major client, they would design around what we needed. Their CEO also had a connection to Marfan. It was his niece's need to carry around her medical information in a giant binder that caught his attention and spurred him to create his company and his app-based registry. So besides being able to handle our must-have list, there were other benefits that this company offered. The capability of controlling and managing and sharing your medical records offers a tangible benefit to registry participants. While it would be great if everybody felt altruistically about sharing their data, the reality is that we recognize that some people are going to join primarily for this tangible benefit. The app seamlessly translates into multiple languages, with more languages being added. And we can send surveys to participants to get targeted information and to fill in gaps of information. For instance, a patient's diagnosis. You wouldn't believe how many people go in and fill out their data and neglect to actually say what their diagnosis is. So the app is constantly evolving as well. For example, the biggest challenge in the year since we unveiled the registry has been getting participants to upload all of their information after they register. So as a user, I can admit it can be a little bit tedious given all of the specialist medications and procedures that both my affected son and I have. To address this issue, the company has now worked out a way to automatically upload records from various hospitals' patient portals. So not only does this save a lot of time, but it actually marks in the system what data is from hospitals and what data is put in from patients, including any changes that the patients make to the information that comes from the hospitals. Because we all know sometimes there are errors in our hospital medical records that we have to correct. So this is really valuable information for researchers to be able to have then as they're trying to sift through the de-identified data that comes through. So I want to take you on a tour of part of the app, and then I'll explain how we've recruited participants. There we go. Oh, wait. How do I go back? There we go. Okay. So here you can see how clear the setup process is. You know up front what you need to submit and agree to before you begin. Okay, so here you can see everything that's on the front page. So we have some of the categories of medical record information that you can input. Others include allergies, treatments and therapies, vaccinations, and lab results. When you're working with a patient population that has varied levels of literacy and tech savvy, it's really important to make sure that the registry is simple to read and intuitive to use. So I'm going to show you how to input a piece of medical information. We'll start with clicking on the plus sign that you see at the bottom right of the screen. For this example, I'm going to say that I have the condition of scoliosis. When you put in a diagnosis, options pop up below it. In this case, it's just scoliosis. I can put in a date for the diagnosis, and then, as you can see in just a second, there are all sorts of options for other information. And at the bottom, you see the share cards, which I'm going to explain in a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I fixed this with surgery, so I'll mark it as in the past and put in an end date. And then back at the main screen, you'll see that it's become nestled in a category marked for past conditions. I really love how very specific the app gets. For example, this screenshot comes from the genetic testing category. So instead of just asking whether the test was positive or negative, I can mark down what type of variant was found, and subsequent screens will ask even more detailed information about the type of mutation or deletion. So does this matter to the average user? Probably not. But it is going to matter to the researchers who use the registry, and patients will most certainly care about the results that come from having quality data. Groups is another way of saying what registries you belong to. So obviously, I'm part of the Marfan and Related Conditions Registry, but I have the option of joining other groups that might be relevant to me as well. Share cards are how we share the information. So this screenshot comes from my actual account. And information on the emergency share card can be accessed by emergency personnel. I can put the URL to this share card on an emergency alert bracelet. Then obviously you see the registry share card. So patients can choose what information of theirs that they want to share with the registry, all of which is de-identified before researchers have access to it. And the researchers don't have access to any images that we put in, but they do have access to everything else. I created a card for our school nurse, which I use for my son, and patients can choose who they share specific information with. So for example, the school nurse, or if I have a family member that's taking my child on vacation. It's also really time-saving when you're seeing a new doctor. You know how they give you all that stuff to fill out? I just print off a copy of my share card and I give that to them instead. So here's a page just for editing and creating the share cards. And then I'm going to show you the school nurse share card. So you can see the URL in the top left, and it comes with an access code. So I can send this URL to anybody that I choose, and then they use that access code to be able to see the share card. And I'll show you how to use information share using a PDF. So I like to just print the PDF and bring it with me to doctor's appointments. And you can see how simple it is to set that up. Obviously, this is just a small portion of the app, but I'm happy to show anybody more later. So we unveiled the registry at our 2018 annual conference with a presentation in the general session that showed how to use the app, and a booth set up throughout the conference with company staff ready to sign people up and walk them through the first steps. A page with background information for the project and a link to register has featured prominently on our website, and there have been many Facebook posts and emails regarding the registry. Our foundation has a group of patient social media influencers, and so they share information about the registry and encourage their networks to join. We also held a webinar on the registry, which included a video tutorial of the app. And at our annual conference, we have a free clinic, a health fair. And so we required all of our patients coming through there to utilize the app to be able to share their medical records with the physicians that are at that clinic. Oh. Wow. Cool. So what I was going to show is that the header that we have on our website, it's one of those rotating headers that go through, and then when you click on it, it will take you to the page that we have set up, and it's under our patient resources section that just talks about the app, and you're able to use the app not only on your phone or your tablet, but on the computer as well. And then I had an example of a Facebook post from a member of our community named Chris, who is widely known, and so he shares what he appreciates about the registry and its use as a way to help people feel more comfortable with it. So overall, patients are really energized at the idea of being able to contribute to research. The registry shows that the foundation is listening to patient concerns about the types of research that they want to see. And we already have a couple of studies that have started using the data that's being input. One is on pregnancy, and one is on neonatal Marfan syndrome, which is a severe subset of the disorder. We currently have close to 2,000 patients that are registered from all 50 states and 57 countries. So where would I like to see the registry go from here? Speaking as a patient, I envision all of our centers of excellence using it with their patients. I want researchers from all over the world to be able to access the data. And I feel like every day I have a new question, and I can't wait to see those questions being answered over the next couple of decades from the information that we're going to be able to collect. A registry like this isn't something that I was sure was possible when we started this process 8 years ago. And it's really exciting for me to see the technology moving forward. The Marfan world that my 8-year-old son was born into is vastly better than the community that existed when I was diagnosed when I was 8 years old. And I feel like this registry is going to make the same true for his children. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya, for that. The last presenter I will introduce to you is going to be James Valentine, and again, he's with associates at Hyman and Phelps and McNamara.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I am a regulatory advisor in an FDA law firm in Washington, D.C., where I primarily work with drug developers and patient advocacy organizations on regulatory issues, moving products through development and ultimately towards FDA approval. And so with that, knowing that about my background, I look forward to sharing with you some technologies that are valuable in helping inform and support drug development and ultimately regulatory decisions. And so today I'm going to speak with you about 3 opportunities. One, I'm going to build on a little bit of what you've heard about patient registries and talk about how through those registries natural history data can be valuable. I also want to talk about patient experience videos as visual evidence in clinical trials. And finally, and probably the technology that this audience might be least familiar with, patient and caregiver perception of change video interviews. So to build on what we've talked about, the previous speakers about patient registries, I cannot say enough how investing in a patient registry and building on that to conduct a natural history study is really an investment in the future of drug development, even before there might be a drug that's being studied for your condition. A rare disease registry can provide a number of things. You've heard a little bit about these first 2 bullet points from our previous presenters, providing insights into the natural course of the disease, providing a starting point for relevant research, and serving as a main source of knowledge about a particular condition. But once you start thinking about how this might be useful for drug development, this type of information generated from registries and natural history studies can help inform your development plan and ultimately your clinical development or your clinical trial designs. Everything from helping determine what is the right patient population to study, having a sense of what are the important prognostic subgroups that you might want to include or exclude, or maybe even just stratify within a trial, relevant both surrogate endpoints as well as clinical outcomes that can serve as endpoints in your studies, things that you may have even tested or embedded in a natural history study already. Of course, having a registry or natural history study allows for the location of patients that could be potential participants in clinical research. And the one that I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about is, these patients and this information can actually serve as a source for creating a historical control group for a clinical trial. So to illustrate this, I'm going to give you an example. So this is the historically controlled trial of Brineura for CLN2. This is a late infantile onset form of Batten disease that primarily affects the nervous system, impacting motor function and language. In this clinical trial, it was a single-arm study, meaning that there was only one group, the group that was being treated with the investigational product, in an open-label design, meaning everyone knew that they were on that product, of 24 patients that then had a longer-term extension study as part of that. Because there was no control, such as a placebo control, that was embedded into this study, the comparison to show that what was seen in the trial was not something that would be expected in the natural course of the disease, a comparison was made to an external control group of matched patients that were extracted from 2 registries that existed in the space, a total of 42 patients. The way that this matching was done was through a best matching type of scenario, where you look and you take the key prognostic factors in the particular condition, the things that are most likely to have an impact on the disease course. And you control for that by matching between the 2 groups. In this case, it was age, genotype, and the motor score at the time of screening of patients. And ultimately, efficacy was assessed at 98 weeks using a motor function score, a measure of patients' ability to walk and crawl. And you can see that the score ranges from 0 to 3, with 3 being a positive outcome. There are always challenges in doing historical controls, and in this case, the FDA review noted that there were small differences in patient characteristics between the historical control and the clinical trial population, despite the matching that was done, as well as there were some imperfections in the comparability between the clinical outcome assessment tool used in the 2 cohorts. So the tool that had been used in the natural history study had been modified slightly, and that was implemented in the clinical trial. However, FDA allowed for the comparison despite that, since it was able to be viewed as comparable. And so what you see when you look at this historically controlled assessment is in the top, this is an assessment of responders, so those who are seeing the drug benefit, that's defined on this motor domain. And so you see the pink on the top, or the red on the top, is the treated group, having more patients that are seeing response, whereas in the natural history group, the blue group, you see that they are having less response, and you see that separation between the 2 groups showing significance in that. Viewed a different way, if you look at the 17 matched pairs, best matched pairs, so you take the natural history subject who most closely resembles each subject that you have in your clinical trial, you'll see if you look across the natural history cohort, you can see the percentages in brackets right there versus the treated cohort, that treatment over time, there was a separation between the 2 groups, showing greater benefit in the treated patients. So this was the basis for the approval of Brineura for CLN2. But as you think about how natural history data might be valuable in this context as a historical control, I point you to FDA's draft guidance, which was updated in March of this year, which does provide some cautions for historical controls. And this is because of an inability to control for certain biases. And so because of that, if you're thinking about whether your natural history might be appropriate in trials for your disease, you would want to look at how predictable is the disease, or at least how predictable is the disease on the outcome of interest that you're studying in a study. You want to see how comparable the populations are, where there's similar standards of care. A lot of natural history databases are from other regions in the world, or from previous time periods where standard of care might be different, and that might make it difficult to do an apples-to-apples comparison. And also how outcomes are assessed. I mentioned that The motor domains were comparable enough that FDA allowed the comparison. However, alternatively, the language domain, so a score on language, was not allowed to be compared because they were unable to establish comparability between the two versions. Of course, it's easier to do a historical comparison when the outcome is objective, because as I mentioned, this was an open label study, so the more subjective the outcome, the more biased you might be from knowing that you're on drug. And then, of course, when the treatment effect is dramatic, that helps because you get that nice separation between groups. And you feel more confident that it wasn't due to chance. So to move into the second technology I wanted to share with you, so patient experience videos as visual evidence, this is something that the director of the Center for Drugs at FDA has been preaching for a number of years now, which is we're a visual society, so why haven't we been better about including videos and assessments within our clinical trials to help us evaluate whether products are truly benefiting patients? And so patient experience videos, they can provide a number of benefits to a clinical program. They can capture patient functioning in a rigorous way. They can provide, on a patient-by-patient level, specific degrees of clinically meaningful change. You can compare the data captured in clinical trials through those different types of rating scales and scorings systems to the videos to make sure that the ratings actually align, and you can do reassessments, so it allows you to go back and check the quality of your data. And it allows, one way you can do that is through independent review. So rather than having the doctor that's actually at a site implementing a particular performance measure, if you're recording it, you can send that video to an independent reviewer who might not know the history of the patient, may not have maybe some bias to want to see that the patient is doing better. And so you can do this by doing patient videos at baseline, throughout the trial, and of course at the end of the trial. You video the patient. You can video the patient actually while they're completing other things, so you're not asking the patient to do more on what are often very long and burdensome days at the clinic. So just you can video them doing, for example, a 6-minute walk test where they're walking, showing the quality of their ability to walk. You could, though, add some additional videos, maybe ask patients to do videos of things that are most troublesome, 2 or 3 activities of daily living to help round out things that you otherwise might be missing in your clinical trial. And then one opportunity here would be to take all of these videos and ask someone who's truly an expert in the disease, who's blinded to whether patients are on treatment or in the control group, and rank them to see if there's those that are on drug are rated as doing best, and those that are on placebo are doing worse. But it's another way of doing this. And so just to show you what this looks like and why it can be so valuable, here's an example from type 1 SMA, a disease that's defined as patients that will never be able to sit unassisted, certainly never able to walk unassisted, defined as really being a floppy baby. You can see on the left. Here, and you see a patient that was in a clinical trial receiving an investigational product and was able to not only hold their head up, sit unassisted, but walk unassisted. And then as you see in this video, in a second, walk unassisted in a very confident way, something that you wouldn't glean from just knowing that the patient walks. You can see that they're able to carry something while walking, has the confidence and balance to reach for a button. Context that you can just never get from rating scales. So the final technology that I'd like to introduce you to is patient and caregiver perception of change video interviews. And these are videos of semi-structured interviews of patients and their caregivers. And to me, this is a technology that really fully maximizes each patient's contribution to the scientific data, especially in rare diseases. Every patient is precious, and we want to learn as much as we can because of their participation in a study. And these types of interviews can help provide a breadth and depth of insight that we otherwise couldn't get from a clinical study. And so really, this methodology is, I think, pretty simple and in a way that's one of the nice things about it. is similar to how you might develop an outcome measure. You do preliminary unstructured qualitative interviews. You learn as much from patients and caregivers about the disease, and you use that information to then guide the development of an interview guide, which you then implement as prospectively defined in your trial to gather information about understanding from patients what's changed since your last visit. And patients won't know whether they're on treatment or placebo, and so you can collect this for both drug and control. You could, in addition, add some of the video performance, like I just showed with the example in spinal muscular atrophy. And you can actually do these interviews by mobile applications. We saw some of the utility of mobile applications in the other presentations. And so you can actually have patients and caregivers do these interviews at home where they're comfortable and are likely to want to participate in this type of activity. And so a quick example here in Barth syndrome, which is an ultra-rare mitochondrial disease. It results in impacts on mobility, as well as has a great impact on fatigue in these patients. And here in this clinical trial for an investigational product, where they employed a crossover design where patients were either on drug and switched to placebo or vice versa, and then all patients go into an open label extension. They're being primarily assessed on 6-minute walk test as well as a measure of fatigue. Patients were asked at the conclusion of that crossover study as they were going into the open label portion, but importantly was still masked to whether when they were on placebo and when they were on drug during crossover. They were given these semi-structured interviews and using a HIPAA-compliant mobile app. And patients and caregivers, like I said, did this in their own home. They could either have someone ask them the questions and record them, or they could actually do it kind of in a selfie mode and in a way interview themselves. And so patients and caregivers were blinded during this, as well as the study staff. And so I share this example to show really what the value of this is. Here's results on 6-minute walk test of all the subjects in the trial. And you can see that there's kind of a trend of improvement in many of them. Others are more stable. So what does that actually mean, though, to a patient? A patient that can now walk some number of meters more in a 6-minute time period. What does that actually mean for a patient's life? Is that something that's actually meaningful? And so here you see examples of responses. You see, the first patient with the S in bracket for being a patient rather than a caregiver, talking about that they were able to walk around at Boy Scout camp for the first time at summer, being able to go on walks, presumably with their peers in scouting, and able to do so much more. A subject that was more flat in their response said that they didn't notice any change. So it actually helps confirm what was seen in the trial. But rather than reading you these, I think what's most useful is to actually see what one of these videos looks like and hear from a patient.
Basically behaving like a normal teenage boy. And there are no limitations. I don't see him inside avoiding his friends. He's out there keeping up with them, and that alone, that it's just normal, is a blessing.
So an impact that would never have otherwise been captured in a clinical trial, to hear from the dad of a patient actually saying that his child, his son, is out having the confidence and ability to spend time with his friends, something that's a notable change and something that's clearly so important for a child and for his son. So, there is a paper that I co-authored, on this methodology that speaks to the value of this. I just can't, in rare diseases, we have so many challenges already in doing clinical trials. There's so much heterogeneity in these diseases that we're looking at. We don't have good outcome measures, and we're not good always at predicting what things to put in our clinical trials that might actually benefit. And so we don't want to have a type 2 error where a drug actually is helping patients, but we don't capture it. And these video interviews allow us to make sure that if there are benefits that are happening, maybe we need another study, but we might not have known that there's even that opportunity without doing this. Or, like with the 6-minute walk example, you don't always know whether the amount of change you see on whatever outcome you picked is actually meaningful to patients. And so this, you get to hear from the patients and their caregivers themselves about what is important, what is meaningful. So thank you very much.
All right, I'm going to invite our speakers back up for about a 10-minute question and answer session. So we'll go ahead and open that up. If you have questions, I will come and deliver a microphone to you.
Thank you for your presentations. The question for the apps that were developed, can you describe the process or walk us through the process with getting your medical advisory, scientific community to approve? What kind of journey, how long did that journey take to get these questions, the apps approved to where they will validate it or accept it?
I know for us that they were a part of the process the entire way. So while the board of directors was having these conversations about what is it that we want in an app, our professional advisory board was also having these conversations. And so then when it came time to do the search, we had those doctors as part of the process. Because if they weren't going to find it valuable, then there wasn't a point in putting in the time and money. And we've done trainings with them as well. And they're constantly giving feedback about how they're using it in their practices or what they would want to collect for research purposes. And that way we can kind of tweak things as we go along.
And for the burden of disease study that we're doing, the app that was developed, the scientific advisory board that each of the patient advocacy groups is a part of also has a clinician and a researcher from each country. And so they were also involved from the very beginning, working with the developer, who's actually here at the conference. They have a poster today. So if you'd like to talk to the developer more about the timeline in which they started working on it, I know that he'd be happy to talk to you further about that. But they were involved from the very beginning and really had a lot of say in the types of questions that they felt really were critical, in helping assess burden of disease. I think it was less than a year, but the developer could tell you more concretely, whether that's realistic. And again, I think it just depends on the type of disease and, the stakeholders that need to be involved with that.
I think once we actually started working with the company that we're working with, who's also here in the tent, it was probably about a year to get things together.
And I think one of our live stream questions we have here, just to kind of piggyback off of that, was who developed the apps for each of you? I don't know if that's something that you can answer.
Our app is through Backpack Health.
And the app that we are part of is Vita Access. They're a UK-based company, and Mark Larkin, the CEO, is here.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pass this on.
Hi, thank you for this. I have two questions. The first one is for Ms. Zimmerman, and then the second one for Ms. Gray. So the first one is when you are doing the disease search, when a patient is having access to the app and they're trying to input the information, I know you searched for a disease or a symptom. Where are all these diseases housed, or are they getting them from online, or has the app aggregated the different diseases so that when you just put the name, it comes up? Because I saw it come up. How does that work?
The app has aggregated all of that.
Okay.
And so, and we've had to add things. We had a patient who was talking with me and said, I had this really rare surgery on my hips, and when I went to put it in, nothing came down on the Dropbox. And so then we emailed Backpack, and they were able to add that in.
Okay, wonderful.
And it drops down for the medications too, and the typical dosages that are used, and all of that is in there.
Wonderful. And then Ms. Gray, so I know yours is international, it's in different countries. So do the researchers or the caregivers here in the US have access to data from Europe and vice versa? Or how does that work with the different countries?
Yes,
With access?
essentially, yes, the data is available. The SAB that I'm a part of and that the other advocacy groups and scientists are a part of have outlined a process in which people can apply to get access to the data, anonymized data. And then the information that I shared with you, some of those slides actually, and I didn't mention this, but every month or 2 months, the app developer sends information out to all the constituents that are a part of the study in different languages. So they see this information and have access to these updates as more data is available to them.
Okay. My son has SMA type 1, and we're old school, and Cure SMA does have an app for us, but their app is not as informational as you showed. Do you see in the future other diseases picking up what your app offers?
I know with Backpack, the company that we're working with, there are many rare disease groups that are using it and have adapted the setup to suit their needs. There's over 7,000 patients that are registered from 99 countries, I think. And some of those groups have, 4 or 5 people because they're very small rare disease groups, and other ones are larger like ours are.
In terms of the app, can you repeat the question? Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think burden of disease, if that hasn't been done in your disease, one really efficient way of doing it is collaborating if there are other organizations in your space. Sponsors, we have one sponsor that's funding the app, but we had a lot of industry partners offer, to help put some resources towards this. So if you are at a point where you have drugs, in the pipeline, in clinic, you likely can get something like this underwritten. And the way that we're going about gathering this information long-term is going to help contribute to that burden of disease internationally. But we're also seeing just so many learnings along the way that we can apply into patient programs today.
Okay, I know we have a lot of questions in-house, but we also have another live stream question that I want to address. It says, once data makes it into the app, who owns it? Does the patient or the patient advocate maintain ownership? Does the research organization own the data, or does the custodian/developer own the data?
I know for us, the patients have control over what they're putting in and whether or not they're sharing it. So all of that is patient-led, and they can change what they're sharing and what they've put in at any time. In terms of who decides about researchers using the data, I think it's a combination of our foundation and the company that we're working with. But like I had talked about, it was really important in our foundation that we be able to be a gatekeeper for that, to make sure that patient data is being respected and that we're using it for what we wanted to use it for.
And for our app, the sponsor is underwriting the cost of it, so they technically own the data, but it's the patient advocacy groups and the clinicians and scientists that sit on the SAB that determine, who gets access to it, and the sponsor is totally removed from that part of it.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot of questions. We're running a little bit shorter on time, but I can assume that the individuals will be here to answer questions afterwards as well. So I'm going to take one more question, then we'll wrap up here.
Is there any reason somebody would do a registry sort of in the old-fashioned way, as in not in an app, but with a company like Nord or an organization like Nord, where you really go to their website, or possibly people are contacted and then submit their information to a central source? Is this sort of the new way to do a registry?
I think this is the new way to do it because everybody, most everybody's got some kind of phone or internet access, and they want to be able to be a part in it and to be able to have access, which you can't if you're just kind of doing a data dump on another website. So this gets the patients involved, which I think is really important.
Yeah, so I think the mobile interface is the way that, in terms of the way that patients and caregivers might engage with the registry is kind of the new way of doing it. But there are certainly limitations to what can be collected by an app. So even the things that I talked about in clinical trials can be included in a registry, patient interviews, videos, things like that. But you still want to think about what other kind of more traditional information might you want to collect. And that doesn't mean a mobile app can't be a way to kind of interface with patients still, but you might want to consider ultimately putting in place different kind of natural history study protocols, collect health information, and that might require something that's beyond what the app can handle. And so having something on the back end that can include inputs directly from healthcare providers, different things that are done in the clinic, I think is still very important. So, it doesn't mean that doesn't mean the app isn't the way that the patients engage, but certainly there's more traditional things you want to measure that an app might be limited.
We use Backpack Health.
Our app is called CMT and Me. That's the branded name of it, but the company that developed it is called Vita Access.
Okay. So lunch is after this, so we can continue for about 5 more minutes if it's okay with our speakers to answer questions. But I could also wrap it up, so I guess it's up to you. I do know we have a few more burning questions that we're wanting to be asked. I'll take 2 more questions and then I'll wrap it up fully.
How do you know the information you're receiving on the app is from an actual patient?
As opposed to somebody who is just making stuff up on the internet?
So, whether it be, different types of ways of getting patient experience data, whether it be a survey or a registry with an app, there is always the opportunity as part of the onboarding process to request some kind of confirmation of diagnosis. So I've seen that done in certain types of projects where, it could be very liberal. So, any kind of documentation that refers to the diagnosis, even maybe an IEP document or something like that, or you could be very more restrictive and require something from the treating physician speaking to the diagnosis, but something that could be easily uploaded and then just to be that proof and confirmation of diagnosis.
Quick question. What's the initiation cost for the registry and then like the ongoing cost in general?
I am not sure, but if you want to stop by the Backpack Health booth later, they could probably give you the numbers for ours.
I would say the same. I would go to the Vita Access poster, and because it's going to depend on the disease and the progression of the disease, what the cost would be.
Thank you guys so much for your presentations. I'm going to close the questions. Yeah, it's really exciting just to see how technology is really